I remember the sound first. Not the shouting, not the scrape of chair legs across the floor, not even the slap itself. It was the applause. Just a few small claps, neat, pleased, almost polite. The kind of sound you might hear after a speech at a luncheon. That was the part that stayed with me. My name is Margaret Lawson. I was 59 when all of this began. For most of my adult life, I worked in family law in Columbus, Ohio. People sometimes described me as quiet or calm in situations that made others emotional. Some even mistook that for softness. It wasn't softness. It was training. When you spend 30 years listening to people tell the truth in fragments, you learn something about patience. You learn not to rush a moment. You learn to watch first. My daughter Clara had invited me for dinner that Sunday because it was close to the anniversary of my late husband's birthday. She said she didn't want me sitting alone in my townhouse, reheating soup and pretending that was enough. She had a way of saying things plainly when she wanted them to sound casual. "Come over," she told me on the phone. "I'm making pot roast, Dad's kind. The one with too much rosemary." I smiled when she said that. Howard always used too much rosemary and insisted it made the whole dish serious. That was his word, serious. At the time, I didn't think much of the pause before Clara added one more sentence. "Ethan's mother will be there too." Looking back, that pause meant something. Clara lived in a newer development outside Dublin, in one of those large houses with pale stone fronts, black shutters, and lawns that looked neat but never quite lived in. Ethan liked things that way. Clean lines, polished surfaces, everything arranged carefully. You could feel it the moment you stepped inside. Clara opened the door before I knocked twice. She hugged me lightly, carefully. That was the first thing I noticed. The second was that she was wearing a long-sleeved blouse, even though the house was warm enough that I had already loosened my scarf. The third thing was harder to name. A person can stand right in front of you and still seem slightly absent around the edges. "You made good time," she said. Traffic was kind. She gave a small smile. "Mom, no traffic is kind on a Sunday." I remember touching her arm for a moment and feeling her tense beneath the fabric. Just briefly. Then Ethan appeared in the entryway with that polished public smile of his. He worked in industrial consulting and had the kind of face people trusted quickly, clear eyes, careful haircut, measured voice. "Margaret," he said warmly. "Good to see you." Behind him came his mother, Dorothy Cole, holding a glass of white wine by the stem, as if she were posing for a magazine photograph. She was elegant, in a deliberate way. Everything about her seemed arranged to suggest discipline. Pearls, perfect posture. A smile that never quite reached warmth. "So nice that we can all be together," she said. That word "together" landed strangely. I stepped into the dining room and immediately noticed how carefully the table had been set. Crystal water glasses, cloth napkins folded into precise rectangles, serving spoons aligned in straight lines. Clara had been cooking for hours, I could tell. The roast smelled right. The potatoes carried that soft, buttery scent that belongs in older kitchens, not these polished, open-plan rooms with stone counters and under-cabinet lighting. There are small details I can still picture clearly if I let myself. A water ring near Ethan's plate. A tiny chip on the edge of one serving dish. Clara's wedding photograph on the sideboard, turned slightly inward as if someone had moved it and never quite placed it back. Later, I realized that moment mattered more than I understood. We sat down. Ethan at the head of the table, Dorothy to his right, Clara beside them. I sat across from her. For a brief second, I had the strange feeling that she had been placed there rather than seated there. Not trapped exactly, just arranged. Dinner began with the kind of conversation that sounds full, but never actually says anything. Dorothy talked about a charity fundraiser. Ethan described a client visit in Indianapolis. Clara spoke only when someone addressed her, and even then her answers were brief, careful. as if each sentence had already been edited before she said it. I asked about her work. She had trained as a chemical engineer and used to talk about her projects with real energy manufacturing systems, compliance improvements, the kind of things most people find dull, but she somehow made interesting. That night she said only, "Busy. We're in a transition phase." That was all. Ethan answered before I could ask anything else. "She's scaling back a little," he said. "Better balance." Clara nodded slightly but didn't look at him. Some people mistake silence for permission. I remember thinking that then, though I didn't say it aloud. Dorothy took a bite of roast and smiled faintly. "Clara's still learning consistency," she said. "Aren't you, dear?" Clara replied quietly. "I followed the same recipe." Dorothy dabbed her mouth with her napkin. "Yes," she said, "but recipes aren't judgment. I have heard cruelty expressed in many ways over the years. Loud cruelty is obvious. Quiet cruelty is the kind people excuse. It slips into a room dressed as manners. I kept eating, kept watching. A procedural mind notices patterns before it reacts. Who interrupts? Who apologizes? Who expects the apology before it arrives? The entire dinner had a structure, and Clara knew it better than I did. When Ethan wanted water, he didn't ask. He shifted his glass slightly toward her. When Dorothy wanted more gravy, she sighed softly first. When Clara sat for more than a minute, one of them found a reason for her to stand again. At some point, I noticed a faint discoloration near Clara's jaw beneath her hairline. It could have been shadow, it could have been makeup, it could have been what I suspected. I didn't ask then. I wish I had asked then. Halfway through dinner, Clara reached across the table to refill Ethan's water. Her hand shook slightly, just enough that a few drops spilled onto the white tablecloth. No one gasped. No one raised their voice. Ethan simply set down his fork. That's when the room went quiet. He looked at the tablecloth, then at Clara. "Do you see what you did?" he asked. His voice was low, controlled. That was what made it dangerous. Clara immediately said, "I'm sorry. I'll fix it." She had already started to stand when he rose from his chair. I wish I could say instinct took over. It didn't happen that way. The first slap came so fast it almost didn't register. Then the second, then the third. Clara's chair tipped backward and she hit the floor, her shoulder striking first before her cheek touched the hardwood. And Dorothy, God help me Dorothy, clapped her hands once, twice, with quiet approval. "That," she said calmly, "is how she learns." I have replayed those 10 seconds more times than I care to admit. People imagine the mind shuts down during moments like that. Mine did the opposite. Everything became extremely clear. I saw Clara on the floor, one hand gripping the leg of the chair. I saw Ethan breathing heavily, not surprised by himself at all. I saw Dorothy smiling, the way someone smiles when a suspicion has just been confirmed. And I saw my handbag on the chair beside me. Phone inside, left pocket, screen facing down. Beneath all of that, I felt something colder than panic. Recognition. This was not the first time. No one behaves that efficiently the first time. For a few seconds, I didn't speak. Ethan may have thought that meant fear. Dorothy certainly did. She lifted her wine glass and said lightly, "Some women need correction before they understand what marriage requires." I stood, not quickly. Quickly would have created a scene. I wasn't interested in a scene. I took my phone from my handbag and unlocked it. Ethan said, "Margaret, don't overreact." That phrase usually means the truth has arrived earlier than the liar expected. I looked directly at him. "You should be very careful what you say next." Dorothy laughed softly. "This is a family matter." "No," I said calmly, opening my call log. "It stopped being a family matter when it became a crime. I called dispatch first. Then I contacted someone I knew in the county system, not for special treatment, but to ensure there would be no confusion about what had just happened. I gave the address clearly, repeated it once, reported an active domestic assault with witnesses present. Then I placed the phone on the table and activated recording. A small click, a red light, time beginning to move forward. I can still see Ethan's expression when he realized what that meant. The lawyer looked up and paused. Except this time, I was the lawyer, and he was the one realizing too late that procedure had already begun. I walked around the table and crouched beside Clara. Her cheek was already reddening. "Don't speak yet," I told her quietly. "Just breathe." She nodded once. Behind me, Dorothy said sharply, "You have no right to come into my son's house and create this kind of spectacle." I stood again and turned toward her. "Mrs. Cole," I said, "you applauded an assault. Please keep speaking if you wish. The recorder is running." That was the first moment she looked uncertain. Outside, faint at first, I heard the sound of sirens, still distant, but coming closer. And standing there in that dining room with the roast cooling on the table and the napkins still folded and the water stain spreading slowly across the cloth, I understood something I had missed for far too long. That dinner hadn't revealed the problem. It had interrupted it. That difference mattered. I helped Clara sit upright against the wall. Ethan took one step forward, then stopped when I met his eyes. "Do not come any closer," I said. And he didn't. People, like Ethan, often confuse control with authority. But authority had already been called. And once procedure begins, it does not care who set the table. The sirens grew louder as the minutes passed. Then they softened again as the vehicles slowed somewhere along the street. I remember glancing at the clock on the wall above the kitchen archway. 6:47 p.m. It felt strange to focus on something that ordinary, while Clara was sitting on the floor beside me, holding a folded napkin against her cheek. The napkin had a small embroidered pattern along the edge, something she must have bought to make the house feel more like a home. A faint red mark had already begun spreading through the fabric. Ethan had moved toward the far side of the dining room. His breathing had steadied, but his expression had changed. The anger was still there, but now it was layered with calculation. Dorothy, on the other hand, looked mostly irritated. "You're making a spectacle," she said again, though more quietly this time. I didn't answer. The recording on my phone continued quietly on the table between us. Clara leaned slightly toward me. I could feel the tremor in her arm. Not panic exactly, but the kind of trembling that comes after the body finally realizes what has just happened. "You shouldn't have come tonight," she whispered. That sentence told me more than anything else. At the time, I didn't respond. I simply placed my hand over hers and waited. The knock on the front door came 3 minutes later. 2 officers stepped inside after Ethan opened it. One of them I recognized by face, if not by name. County Patrol. Late 30s. Observant eyes. "Evening," he said, scanning the room in a single practice sweep. His partner saw Clara on the floor immediately and moved toward her. "What happened here?" Ethan began speaking before anyone else could. "It's a misunderstanding," my wife slipped. "Sir," the officer said calmly, raising one hand. "Let her speak." Clara hesitated. For a moment, the entire room seemed to lean toward that decision. Then she looked at me, and she told the truth. The words came slowly at first, but once they began, they didn't stop. "He hit me." The officer nodded once and began writing. Procedure had begun. And when procedure begins, people often start revealing who they really are. Ethan tried charm first, then explanation, then irritation. Dorothy attempted indignation. But the officers weren't interested in tone. They focused only on sequence. Where were you standing? How many strikes? Any previous incidents? At one point, the younger officer glanced at my phone, still recording on the table. "That been running the whole time?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He nodded. That's when the room went quiet for a second time. Ethan looked at the device as if it had personally betrayed him. By 7:12 p.m., Ethan Cole was sitting in the back of a patrol car. Dorothy stood on the front walkway watching the flashing lights fade down the street, her wine glass still in her hand. She said something under her breath that I didn't fully catch. But the tone told me everything. She didn't believe this was the end of anything. And in a way, she was right, because the real story hadn't started with that dinner. It had started years earlier. I didn't fully understand that until later. The first memory returned to me the following morning. It's strange how memory works. It doesn't always arrive when you want it. Sometimes it appears quietly while you're doing something ordinary. I was standing at my kitchen sink, rinsing a coffee mug, when the scene surfaced. Winter. Snow tapping lightly against the windows. Clara standing beside the counter, kneading bread dough. Flour dust drifting through the air. Ethan says his mother is very traditional, she had said casually. What does that mean? I asked. She shrugged. She believes husbands should lead the household. I dried my hands and looked at her. And what do you believe? Clara laughed softly. I believe Ethan's mother doesn't know me very well. At the time, it sounded like confidence. Later, I realized it was hope. The second memory surfaced while Clara and I sat outside the emergency exam room that same night after the assault. The hospital hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant and vending machine coffee. 2 years earlier, Clara had called me just after midnight. Mom, she had said quietly, Ethan got angry tonight. I remember driving across town in steady rain. When I arrived, she was sitting on the front steps of their first house, holding an ice pack against her wrist. What happened? I asked. He slammed a cabinet door, she said. And? She looked away. I was standing too close. There was a pause before she added something I have never forgotten. He said it was my fault for surprising him. The third memory was smaller, but sometimes the smallest details matter most. About 18 months before the dinner, Clara and I had been walking through a grocery store together. She reached for a jar of pasta sauce. Her sleeve slid back slightly. There was a faint yellow bruise near her elbow. What happened? I asked. She answered immediately. Gym accident. But she didn't meet my eyes when she said it. Back then, I let it go. I regret that. Memory can be a difficult witness. It doesn't always appear when you want it, but when it does, it tends to bring company. By the time Clara and I returned to my townhouse after the hospital visit that night, it was close to midnight. The house felt smaller than usual. Clara sat at the kitchen table while I made tea. The kettle clicked softly as it cooled. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Then she said something I hadn't expected. They're not going to let this go. Who? I asked. She looked down at her hands. Ethan and his mother. There was no drama in her voice, just certainty. I placed the tea in front of her. Neither will I said. She stared at the steam rising from the cup. You don't understand, she said quietly. They have connections, money, lawyers. I allowed myself a small smile. Clara, I said gently, I am a lawyer. That made her laugh for the first time that night. Only a little. Then the seriousness returned. What happens now? That was the moment I knew the next step. Not anger, not revenge, verification, procedure, documentation. I reached for my phone and opened my contacts. There was one name I had not needed to call in several years. A colleague who specialized in criminal defense and domestic protection orders. Someone who understood how cases like this move through the system. I pressed dial. The phone rang twice before he answered. Margaret, he said. This must be serious. I looked at Clara sitting across from me. It is, I said. There was a pause. Then he asked the only question that mattered. What do you need? I took a breath. Counsel, I said. And that was the moment the second phase began. Not the emotional one, the procedural one. Because people like Ethan Cole often believe power is loud, but real power tends to arrive quietly, usually in the form of paperwork. And by the time they realize that, the paperwork already has their name on it. The next morning began earlier than I expected. I woke at 5:12 a, the way people sometimes do after a night when the body technically sleeps, but the mind continues working quietly underneath it all. For a moment, I stayed in bed listening to the small sounds of morning beginning outside the windows. A truck shifting gears somewhere down the street. A dog barking once and then stopping. The faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Clara was sleeping in the guest room. At least I hoped she was sleeping. When I checked on her around 2 in the morning, she had been lying on her side with one hand tucked beneath the pillow, the way she used to when she was young. The bruise along her cheek had darkened overnight. Injuries sometimes reveal themselves slowly like that. I didn't wake her. There would be enough questions waiting once morning arrived. By 6:10, I was sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and a yellow legal pad. Some habits never leave you. When something becomes uncertain, procedure becomes the anchor. At the top of the page, I wrote 3 words. Incident timeline. Then I began listing what I knew. Sunday, approximately 6:45 p.m., dining room, physical assault witnessed. Audio recording initiated immediately afterward. Hospital exam, approximately 8:30 p.m. Officer statements recorded. Arrest. Ethan Cole transported by county patrol. Those were the facts. Everything else would come later. Clara entered the kitchen, a little after 7, wearing one of my older sweaters. The sleeves were too long for her and had been rolled back twice. She poured coffee without asking if it was all right. I appreciated that. It meant she still felt some ownership of the room. We sat quietly for a few minutes. Eventually, she said, almost to herself, "He's probably out already." I looked up from the pad. "Possibly," I said. "That depends on the magistrate's schedule and charge classification." She nodded slowly. Then she asked the question people usually ask once the first moment of clarity settles. "What happens now?" Before I could answer, my phone vibrated against the table. The screen showed the name I had called the night before, Daniel Pierce. Daniel and I had known each other for nearly 20 years. He had the kind of voice that always sounded slightly amused, even when discussing very serious matters. "Morning," he said, when I answered. "Morning. I've already checked the arrest log," he continued. "Your son-in-law spent the night in county." Clara looked up immediately when she heard that. Daniel kept speaking. "Assault charge listed. Domestic classification. That gives us a little room to work." "That's good," I said. "Not good," he corrected gently. "Structured." He paused before adding something that shifted the morning slightly. "Margaret, there's something else." I felt the familiar tightening that comes when a case begins revealing additional layers. "What is it?" I pulled some public filings connected to Ethan Cole's family business group. And there have been several civil disputes over the past decade. That didn't surprise me. "What kind of disputes?" "Property transfers, internal trust disagreements." He hesitated briefly. "And a wrongful death inquiry about 10 years ago, that didn't go very far." I stopped writing. "Whose death?" There was a small pause. "Ethan's father." Clara looked at me with confusion. I didn't repeat the words immediately. Instead, I asked the next procedural question. "Cause of death?" Listed as accidental fall. "And the inquiry?" Closed quickly. I thanked him and ended the call. For a moment, the kitchen felt very quiet. Clara noticed immediately. "What is it?" I hesitated, not out of strategy, but instinct. Still, truth has a way of entering a room, whether we invite it or not. "Your father-in-law's death was investigated," I said slowly. She frowned. "Ethan told me his father fell down a staircase." "That may be accurate," I said, but something in my voice must have carried a question mark. Clara looked down at the coffee cup in her hands. That's strange, she said. What is? I never saw stairs in that house. That was the first unexplained detail. I wrote it down. Later that morning, we drove downtown to Daniel's office. Columbus in early morning has a particular look. Brick buildings catching the sunlight, office towers reflecting pale blue sky, commuters beginning another ordinary day. Inside Daniel's building, the air smelled faintly of paper and printer ink. He met us in a conference room with tall windows and a long oak table. The kind of room where difficult conversations become official. Clara sat beside me. Daniel placed a folder on the table. I reviewed the recording you sent, he said. That's good, I replied. It's very clear. He slid a document across the table toward Clara. This is the temporary protection order request. She read the first line carefully. You think I should file this? Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at me, then back at Clara. I think you should protect yourself. Clara sat very still for a moment. Then she signed. That's when everything changed. Because once paperwork enters the system, the story stops belonging entirely to the people involved. It becomes part of the record. And records move forward, whether people like it or not. Outside the office, the city traffic sounded louder than before. But the next pressure arrived quickly. At 1:42 that afternoon, Clara's phone rang. The caller ID showed Ethan's name. She stared at the screen. The phone rang again. And again. Finally, she turned it face down on the table. 10 minutes later, my own phone rang. Dorothy Cole. I answered. Mrs. Lawson, she said with surprising calm. This entire situation is unfortunate. I didn't respond, she continued. My son is under considerable stress. Clara understands that. Still silence. Then Dorothy said something that revealed more than she intended. You should encourage her to correct the report. Correct? I asked. Yes. Tell the police it was a misunderstanding. I leaned back slightly in my chair. You applauded the assault, I said. The line went quiet for 2 seconds. Then she replied, her voice colder now. You should be careful, Margaret. About what? About starting something you cannot finish. There was no anger in her tone, only confidence. The kind of confidence people carry when they believe the system will bend for them. I ended the call. Daniel looked at me from across the table. Pressure already? He asked. Yes. Clara watched both of us. Is this going to get worse? Daniel answered gently. Yes. Then he added something equally important. But worse doesn't always mean losing. He tapped the folder again. The system moves slowly, he said. But once it starts, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Because we all understood something at that moment. Ethan Cole believed the dinner had been a private incident. A household correction. A closed door. But that door had already opened. And somewhere in the system, a record now existed. A case number. A timeline. People like Ethan rarely understand how important that first record becomes. They think the story begins with arguments, or lawyers, or courtrooms. But it doesn't. It begins with documentation. And documentation has a very long memory. What none of us realized yet was that the trail we had just opened would lead much further than any of us expected. The first court date arrived sooner than I expected. 3 mornings after the arrest, Clara and I walked into the Franklin County Municipal Court building just after 9. The courthouse had the same atmosphere. Most American court buildings carry polished floors, fluorescent lighting, and a quiet tension that hums beneath the surface of ordinary conversation. I had spent a good portion of my career inside places like that. Still, that morning felt different. Clara walked beside me holding the slim folder Daniel had prepared. Inside were copies of the police report, the hospital exam summary, and the temporary protection order request she had signed the day before. Her steps were steady, but I could feel the weight she carried in the silence between them. The hallway outside the courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and copier toner. People stood in clusters along the walls, attorneys speaking quietly to clients, clerks calling names, a bailiff moving calmly through the corridor, like someone who had seen every possible version of human behavior and no longer felt surprised by any of it. At 9:22 a.m., Ethan Cole walked through the hallway doors. He was wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. His hair was carefully arranged, his posture composed. If someone didn't know the context, they might have mistaken him for a corporate executive attending a meeting. But I noticed something else. He wasn't alone. Dorothy walked beside him, and behind them were two attorneys. That told me something immediately. This wasn't just defense, it was strategy. Clara saw them too. Her shoulders tightened slightly. Ethan stopped a few feet away from us. His eyes moved from Clara to me and back again. "Clara?" he said quietly. She didn't answer. He looked at me. "This is unnecessary." I studied his posture carefully before replying. "You struck your wife in front of witnesses," I said calmly. "The court will decide what is necessary." Dorothy stepped forward then, her voice smooth and measured. "You've made a mistake, Margaret." I didn't respond. Sometimes silence is the most precise answer available. The courtroom doors opened at 9:30. Inside, the atmosphere shifted immediately. Courtrooms have that effect on people. Voices lower, movements slow. Authority becomes visible without needing to raise its voice. The judge entered a few minutes later and began calling the docket. When Ethan's case was called, everyone stepped forward. Daniel stood beside Clara. I remained seated quietly behind them. The judge reviewed the initial charge summary, then looked toward Ethan. "Mr. Cole," he said, "you are charged with domestic assault. Do you understand the allegation?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." His attorney spoke next. "Your Honor, we request reasonable bail and clarification that the alleged event occurred during a domestic disagreement." The judge turned to Clara. "Miss Cole, is the protection order request yours?" "Yes," she said. Her voice did not shake. The judge nodded once. Then he said something that shifted the entire room. "The court will review the submitted recording before determining further action." Ethan's lawyer froze for half a second. That's when the room went quiet. Daniel handed the clerk a flash drive. Moments later, the recording played through the courtroom speakers. Every word, every movement. Then Dorothy's voice. That is how she learns. No one spoke while the audio finished. The judge leaned back slightly in his chair. Then he looked at Ethan. "The temporary protection order is granted immediately." His gavel tapped once. Procedure had spoken. Outside the courtroom, the air in the hallway felt heavier than before. Ethan's attorneys were already speaking quietly with him. Dorothy stood near the wall, her posture still composed, but the confidence around her eyes had cracked slightly. Clara exhaled slowly beside me. Daniel closed his folder. "That's the first step," he said, but that moment marked something else as well. Because the story was about to divide into two directions. One path would move through institutions, bank records, property filings, financial structures. The other would move through people, neighbors, co-workers, family conversations. Both had already started moving. We simply didn't realize how far they would go. Later that afternoon, the financial side appeared first. Daniel called around 3:40. "I've been reviewing Ethan's business disclosures," he said. "And?" I asked. "There's something unusual about the property holdings connected to his family." "What kind of unusual?" "Ownership structures." I wrote the words down. He continued. "Several assets appear tied to trusts created by Ethan's father. And those trusts list Clara as a beneficiary." That surprised me. Clara had never mentioned anything like that. Daniel's voice remained calm. "But here's the interesting part." "What part?" Recent filings show someone attempted to modify those trusts. By whom? Dorothy. I sat quietly for a moment. The paperwork already had Clara's name on it, and someone had tried to change that. Meanwhile, the social side of the story began shifting too. The next morning, Clara received 3 calls from co-workers. Not about the court hearing, about rumours. Someone had already started telling people that Clara had overreacted, that Ethan had been provoked, that the entire situation had been exaggerated. Clara stared at her phone after the 3rd call. "I knew this would happen," she said quietly. "Reputation pressure," Daniel explained later. Classic tactic. That afternoon, Clara and I stopped at a small grocery store near my house. While she stood at the checkout counter, a woman from her engineering firm approached her cautiously. "Clara?" the woman asked. Clara nodded. "I heard something happened." Clara took a slow breath. Then she answered simply. "It did." The woman hesitated before speaking again. "You're doing the right thing." That moment mattered more than people realize, because social pressure doesn't always move in one direction. Sometimes it creates witnesses. By the end of that week, the 2 lanes had fully opened. Financial filings, social reactions, each revealing something new. But the most important discovery was still ahead. Daniel called again the following Monday morning, and this time his voice carried a different tone. "Margaret," he said, "I found the staircase." I paused. "What staircase?" "The one Ethan's father supposedly fell down." There was a quiet rustling of papers on the line. It wasn't in the house. A chill ran through me. Where was it? Daniel spoke carefully. "In a property Dorothy sold 3 weeks after the death." That was the moment I understood something much larger might be hidden beneath all of this. One act of violence had opened a door, but behind that door there might be an entire history waiting to be examined. The phrase stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. "I found the staircase." Daniel had said it calmly, almost casually, the way someone might mention locating an old file in a storage room. But the meaning behind it settled somewhere deep and quiet, like a weight that hadn't fully revealed itself yet. At the time, I didn't answer right away. "Explain," I said finally. I could hear papers shifting faintly on Daniel's end of the call. 10 years ago, he began, Ethan's father, Robert Cole, was reported to have died after falling down a staircase in the family home. "Yes," I said. "That's the version listed in the original report. And the problem? The property records." I waited. The house where the death supposedly occurred was sold 3 weeks later. That alone didn't sound impossible. People sell houses after a death all the time. But something in Daniel's voice suggested there was another piece still coming. "And," I asked, "the buyer renovated the structure 2 years later. Which means the staircase described in the report never existed in that location." For a moment, the kitchen felt very quiet. Clara was standing near the window, watering a small plant she had brought with her from the house she had shared with Ethan. She had been doing it absent-mindedly while I spoke on the phone. Now she stopped. "Mom?" she asked. I covered the receiver lightly. "Just a moment." Then I returned to Daniel. "So the death location doesn't match the structure, correct? And the investigation?" "Closed within 4 days." I leaned back in my chair. "Who signed off on it?" "County medical examiner at the time," Daniel said. Then he added, "But there's something else." I picked up my pen again. "What?" "The property where the staircase actually existed, and it belonged to a smaller rental property held under a trust." "Which trust?" "The Cole Family Trust." "The paperwork already had their name on it." Daniel continued, "And Margaret, that trust was partially reassigned 3 years ago." "To whom?" There was a brief pause. "To Clara." I looked across the room. Clara was watching me now, sensing that the conversation had shifted. "Thank you, Daniel," I said quietly. "Send everything." When the call ended, the ordinary sounds of the house returned, the refrigerator humming, the clock ticking softly on the wall. Clara sat down across from me. What happened? I took a slow breath. Your father-in-law's death may not have happened where everyone believed it did. Her eyebrows pulled together. What do you mean? I slid the legal pad toward her. The staircase in the original report doesn't exist in the house where the accident supposedly happened. She read the words slowly. Then she whispered something unexpected. Dorothy hated that house. What house? The rental one. Clara rubbed her temples slightly, as if trying to pull older memories back into focus. I only saw it once, she said. When? About a year after Ethan and I married. That became the first memory she described. We drove out there in the winter, she said slowly. Snow everywhere. Ethan said his mother needed some paperwork from the place. What paperwork? I don't remember exactly. She paused. But I remember the smell. Smell? Old wood. Dust. Like the house hadn't been lived in for a long time. Then she added something quietly. Dorothy told Ethan not to take me upstairs. The second memory surfaced a few minutes later. We were at their main house, Clara said. Dorothy was talking about Robert's death. What did she say? Clara looked down at the table. She said accidents happen when men lose their footing. I waited. And Ethan? He laughed. The third memory was smaller, but sometimes the smallest details matter most. I remember something else, Clara said. What? The day after the funeral, yes? Dorothy sold the rental property. That timing settled into the timeline like a missing piece. 3 weeks after the death, property sold. Structure changed. Investigation closed. Later that evening, Daniel emailed the full set of documents. Property transfers, trust assignments, sale records, inspection reports. Everything had been archived quietly for years. I printed the first batch and placed them into a new folder. Evidence actions had begun. Printed, logged, archived. But evidence alone rarely moves a story forward. Pressure usually follows. And it arrived that same night. At 8:17 p.m., Clara's phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. She answered cautiously. Hello? The voice on the other end was calm. Too calm. This is Mrs. Cole. Clara stiffened slightly. Dorothy? Yes. There was a brief pause. Then Dorothy said something that shifted the temperature of the room. You've created a situation that is becoming unnecessarily complicated. Clara didn't respond. Dorothy continued. You should withdraw the protection order. Clara looked at me. Then she said very clearly, no. Another pause followed. Longer this time. Finally, Dorothy spoke again. You think you understand the system, she said. But you don't understand what my family has built. Clara's voice stayed steady. I understand enough. Then she ended the call. The room remained quiet for a moment afterward. Clara looked at the stack of documents beside me. What happens next? I tapped the top page. Verification. Meaning? We confirm everything. She nodded slowly. Outside the window, the streetlights had come on. Cars moved along the road in steady lines. Ordinary life continuing exactly as it always had. But something beneath that ordinary rhythm had already begun shifting. Because Dorothy Cole believed control came from influence, from reputation, from quiet pressure behind closed doors. But she had overlooked something. Procedure does not recognize influence. Procedure recognizes records. And now the records had begun speaking. What none of us realized yet was that those records were about to attract attention from a place Dorothy had not anticipated. Compliance. And when compliance departments begin asking questions, people who once felt powerful sometimes discover how little control they truly had. The email arrived 3 days later. It came at 9:08 the morning while Clara and I were sitting at the kitchen table reviewing the first set of trust filings Daniel had sent earlier in the week. The subject line looked ordinary enough. Franklin County Financial Compliance, Property Inquiry. At first, I assumed it might be routine. Sometimes property transfers involving trusts trigger quiet verification reviews. Most of the time, those reviews amount to nothing more than clerical confirmations. Documents checked, signatures verified, accounts updated. But the sender's address told me something different. The inquiry wasn't coming from a county clerk. It was coming from a compliance analyst at a regional bank. I opened the message slowly. Inside was a brief paragraph requesting clarification regarding several trust-related property transfers connected to the Cole family trust. Two lines in particular caught my attention. Recent filings indicate beneficiary status adjustments involving Miss Clara Lawson. The transfer pattern associated with these records requires documentation verification before escrow release can proceed. Clara leaned forward slightly. What does that mean? It means, I said carefully, someone attempted to move property connected to the trust, and the bank stopped it, temporarily. That was the moment the situation shifted. Financial institutions don't pause transfers unless something in the documentation fails to match the original structure. And when paperwork stops moving, people who expected money to move usually notice very quickly. The pressure arrived that same afternoon. At 1:42 p.m., Daniel called again. "Margaret," he said, "you're going to want to see this. What happened?" "The Cole Family Trust attempted a property liquidation yesterday." "What property?" "The rental property. The staircase house." "And?" I asked. The bank froze the escrow. "Why?" "Because Clara is listed as a beneficiary." Clara looked at me sharply when she heard that. "I didn't authorize anything." "Exactly," Daniel said through the speaker. That was the moment the procedural machine tightened another notch. Financial Lane had fully opened. Later that afternoon, we drove downtown again, this time to meet Daniel at the brokerage office, handling the trust accounts. The building lobby was quiet, its marble floors reflecting the afternoon light that came through the tall glass windows. The receptionist greeted Daniel by name, which suggested he had already been there earlier. Inside the conference room, we were joined by a compliance officer. Her name was Angela Moreno. She spoke with the calm precision of someone who had spent years explaining financial rules to people who assumed those rules would never apply to them. "We're conducting a documentation review," she said. Clara nodded. "Why?" Angela rotated the laptop screen slightly so we could see. Displayed on it was a list of trust assets. Property parcels, investment accounts, 2 commercial leases, and 1 line highlighted in yellow. Beneficiary confirmation, pending. Angela continued. "Miss Lawson, your name appears in the original trust structure created by Robert Cole in 2009. Clara blinked. "I didn't know that." "That's not unusual," Angela replied. "Many beneficiaries aren't aware until assets begin moving." She scrolled further. "However, an amendment filed 3 years ago attempted to reduce your status." "By whom?" I asked. Angela glanced at the document. "Dorothy Cole." The room grew very still. Angela continued in the same even tone. "Because the amendment conflicts with earlier beneficiary protections, the system triggered a verification requirement." I understood immediately. Trust law contains certain protective clauses that cannot simply be erased after the fact, especially when beneficiary consent is required. And Clara had never signed anything. Angela closed the file and said something that settled into the room with quiet finality. "Escrow doesn't recognize assumptions." That was the moment the structure became visible. For years, Dorothy had controlled the family's financial assets. But Robert Cole, the man who supposedly died in that staircase accident, had built something into the trust. A safeguard. One Dorothy either overlooked or assumed she could override later. Clara stared at the screen. "So the property sale can't happen?" Angela shook her head. not without beneficiary acknowledgement. Meaning Clara? Daniel asked. Yes. While the financial side tightened, the social side began moving too. 2 days later, Clara received a message from one of Ethan's cousins. The message was brief. Your mother-in-law is telling everyone you're trying to steal the family estate. Clara showed it to me without speaking. I read the line twice. Rumor pressure. A familiar tactic. Later that evening, another call came, this time from a neighbor who had lived near Clara and Ethan's house. I saw police there last week, the woman said carefully. I hope Clara is all right. Clara answered politely. She is. The conversation ended kindly enough. But rumors have a way of traveling quickly through extended families. That is the nature of social lane. Stories move faster than documents. But documents last longer. 3 days later, the financial side tightened again. Angela emailed us a new notice. Temporary escrow hold. Compliance review. Daniel read the message aloud. The trust account cannot process asset liquidation until beneficiary verification is completed. Clara leaned back slightly in her chair. So Dorothy can't sell anything? Not yet, Daniel said. But she'll try something else. He was right. Because the next countermove arrived sooner than expected. At 8:15 the following morning, Clara received a legal notice. A civil complaint, filed by Ethan's attorneys. The claim accused Clara of interfering with trust management and damaging the family's financial operations. Clara stared at the document. Can they do that? Daniel smiled faintly. They can file anything, but filings create records. He tapped the page gently. And records create timelines. Clara absorbed that quietly. Her expression had changed over the past week. Less fear, more awareness. Procedure can do that to people. Once someone understands the structure surrounding them, panic tends to fade. Because systems operate according to rules, not emotion. Still, one question remained. The staircase, the death, the property. Daniel looked up from the complaint and said something that shifted the investigation again. I requested the original death report. And? I asked. It arrived this morning. He opened the folder slowly. Then he pointed to a single paragraph near the center. Look at the witness section. I leaned closer. The only listed witness to Robert Cole's fall was Dorothy Cole. Clara inhaled sharply. Daniel continued quietly. That's not the unusual part. What is? I asked. He tapped the timestamp. The emergency call reporting the fall was placed nearly 40 minutes after the time listed for the accident. The room fell silent. 40 minutes. That kind of gap doesn't prove anything on its own, but it does raise questions. And questions are exactly what investigators, compliance departments, and legal systems are designed to follow. For the first time since that dinner night, it felt like the situation had moved beyond a domestic violence case. Much further, because the paper trail was no longer pointing only at Ethan, it was pointing directly at Dorothy. And the system had begun asking questions she might not be able to control. The 40-minute gap sat quietly in the middle of the report. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't highlighted. It wasn't even mentioned in the original investigation summary. But once you noticed it, it was impossible to ignore. I remember Daniel sliding the report across the conference table toward me, while Clara watched from the other side. Emergency call logged at 9:14 p.m., he said. And the estimated fall, 8:36 p.m. I ran my finger slowly down the printed line. 40 minutes. In most accidents, people call for help immediately. Instinct takes over. Panic fills the space where thinking used to be. But 40 minutes is enough time for many things. Enough time to move. Enough time to think. Enough time to decide what the story will become. Clara looked between us. Are you saying? Daniel raised one hand gently. I'm saying the timeline deserves attention. His wording was careful. That's how professionals speak when facts haven't yet crossed the threshold into conclusions. But the shift had already begun. The following morning, I woke to a message from Angela Moreno. Compliance follow-up, required documentation. The bank wanted certified confirmation of the original trust structure. That meant locating the full founding documents Robert Cole had signed. Sometimes those documents sit quietly in courthouse archives for decades. Sometimes they reveal details the people managing the trust hoped no one would read closely. Daniel made the request immediately. By early afternoon, the county clerk's office had located the file. I still remember the smell of the archive room when we went to retrieve it. Old paper, dust, and the faint chemical scent of document preservation. The clerk placed the thick envelope on the counter. "Original trust filing, 2009, she said. Daniel opened it carefully. Inside were dozens of pages. Financial provisions, property schedules, beneficiary clauses. We began reading slowly. Halfway through the packet, Clara suddenly leaned forward. "Wait." Daniel stopped. "What?" She pointed to a paragraph near the center of the page. Robert Cole's signature appeared at the bottom. But above it was a clause that changed the entire financial structure. A protection clause. If Robert Cole died under circumstances involving internal family dispute or unresolved investigation, certain assets could not be transferred or liquidated without approval from all named beneficiaries. Daniel looked up. "Dorothy tried to modify this 3 years ago," he said. "But the original clause still controls." Clara exhaled slowly. "So the bank freeze is automatic," Daniel said. Financial lane tightened again. Meanwhile, the social side began shifting more noticeably. 2 days later, Clara's engineering firm asked her to meet with human resources. She had expected that conversation. Rumors rarely stay outside workplaces for long. The HR manager spoke carefully. "We're aware of a domestic incident involving your spouse." Clara nodded. "Yes. Is there any ongoing safety concern that might affect the workplace?" Clara thought for a moment. "No," she said. The manager studied her quietly. Then she said something Clara didn't expect. "Several employees have already asked if you're all right." Clara blinked. "Oh," the manager smiled gently. "You have more support here than you realize. Social lane doesn't always move against you. Sometimes it reveals where quiet allies were standing all along. But pressure still arrived from the other direction. That evening, Dorothy called again. This time Clara answered on speaker. "Clara," Dorothy said calmly. "Yes, you're damaging your husband's future." Clara didn't respond. Dorothy continued. "The trust was never meant to involve you." I leaned slightly closer to the phone. "That's interesting," I said. Dorothy paused when she heard my voice. "Margaret." "Yes?" "The founding documents say otherwise." Silence filled the line for several seconds. Then Dorothy spoke again, slower now. "You think paperwork will save you?" Clara answered this time. "It's not about saving anyone. What is it about?" Clara's voice remained steady. "Truth." Dorothy exhaled sharply. "You have no idea what you're interfering with." The call ended shortly afterward. That night, Clara and I sat on the back patio while the air cooled and the neighborhood lights came on one by one. She watched a car pass slowly down the street. "Did you ever notice," she said quietly, "how calm systems are?" "What do you mean?" "Courts, banks, records." I nodded. "They don't get angry." "No," she said. "They just keep moving." I thought about that for a moment. Then I said something I had been realizing slowly since the dinner. Some people mistake silence for permission. Clara looked at me. That's exactly what Ethan always thought. The next development arrived 3 days later. Angela Moreno called directly this time. "Margaret," she said. "Yes?" "We've escalated the trust review." "Why?" "Because of the death clause." My stomach tightened slightly. "What about it?" Angela spoke carefully. When a trust includes a dispute-related death clause and a beneficiary raises documentation questions, financial institutions are required to notify the State Fiduciary Review Board. I understood immediately. That means an inquiry. Yes, the structure had tightened again. Ethan and Dorothy had spent years believing their financial control was absolute. But Robert Cole had written something into the system, something patient, something procedural, something that waited quietly until the right questions appeared. And now those questions had been asked, which meant the next phase would not be driven by family arguments, or by rumors, or even by court hearings. It would be driven by review. And review tends to reveal things people believed were buried long ago. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning, not by email, not by courier, by certified mail. I remember that detail clearly because the postal carrier waited at the front door while I signed for it. The envelope was thick, official-looking, and stamped with the return address of the Ohio State Fiduciary Review Board. Clara was in the kitchen when I brought it inside. She looked at the envelope for a moment before speaking. "Is that what I think it is?" I nodded. Yes. Neither of us opened it immediately. Sometimes, the moment before, information becomes real, deserves a pause. Finally, Clara pulled a chair out from the kitchen table and sat down. I slid the envelope toward her, and she carefully tore along the top edge. The letter inside was several pages long. Clara read the first paragraph slowly. Then she handed it to me. The language was exactly what I expected. Formal, neutral, procedural. But the meaning behind it carried quiet weight. Notice of fiduciary review inquiry. Due to documentation inconsistencies associated with the Cole Family Trust, the board had initiated a preliminary review of trust administration and property transfers dating back to Robert Cole's death. The review would examine trust amendment validity, beneficiary modification attempts, asset liquidation filings, and the circumstances surrounding the original death trigger clause. Clara looked up. "What does this mean?" "It means," I said carefully, "the system has started asking questions. Unlike court cases, fiduciary reviews operate quietly. There are no dramatic hearings at first, no raised voices, just requests, documents, timelines, confirmations. But those requests often reach places people never expected. The first reaction came from Ethan. At 2:37 that afternoon, Clara received a message from him. It was the first time he had contacted her directly since the protection order. The message contained only one sentence. "You need to stop this now." Clara stared at the phone for a long moment. Then she placed it face down on the table. Should I respond? "No," I said. "Procedure doesn't respond to pressure. It waits." The next reaction came 2 hours later. Dorothy appeared at my front door. Not announced, not invited, just standing there when I opened it. She looked exactly as she always had. Perfect posture, careful clothing, controlled expression. But there was something different in her eyes. A tension that hadn't been there before. "Margaret," she said, "I believe we need to talk." I stepped aside and allowed her into the living room. Clara remained seated at the kitchen table nearby. Dorothy looked at the documents spread across the surface. "You've created a very unnecessary situation," she said calmly. I didn't answer. Instead, I asked a question. "Did you know about the death clause?" Her eyes flickered. "Only briefly, but long enough." "That clause is outdated," she replied. "Apparently the bank disagrees." She exhaled slowly. "You're making assumptions about matters you don't understand." Clara spoke for the first time. "Then explain it." Dorothy looked at her. For a moment the room felt very still. Finally, Dorothy said something that revealed more than she intended. "Your father-in-law trusted the wrong people." Clara frowned. "What does that mean?" Dorothy didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked slowly toward the window and looked out at the quiet street. Then she turned back toward us. "Robert built a financial structure that was too complicated for its own good. I studied her expression carefully. And the staircase? I asked. Dorothy's gaze shifted toward me. That was an accident. Her voice was steady, but something in the room had changed. Because, for the first time since this entire situation began, Dorothy sounded less certain. Clara leaned forward slightly. Then why did the timeline leave 40 minutes unaccounted for? Dorothy said nothing. Silence can be revealing. Finally, she spoke again. You think a review board will find something after all these years? I answered honestly. I don't know. She nodded slowly. But you're willing to destroy an entire family over speculation? Clara shook her head. No. Then she said something that settled into the room like a quiet verdict. You destroyed it when you told Ethan that hitting me was how I would learn. Dorothy's expression hardened. For a moment, I thought she might respond with anger. Instead, she picked up her purse. You have no idea what you've started, she said. As she reached the door, she paused and turned back. You can't take what was never yours. Clara stood slowly. Then she said the line that would echo later in ways none of us expected. Escrow doesn't recognize assumptions. Dorothy stared at her for several seconds. Then she left. That was the moment the balance shifted. Not emotionally, procedurally. Because the Fiduciary Review Board had already begun requesting documents, property inspectors would now examine the original rental house records. The trust amendments would be audited, bank compliance would freeze any additional transfers, and every document connected to Robert Cole's death would be reviewed again. The escalation had moved beyond family arguments, beyond rumors, beyond private legal maneuvering. The system was now involved. And systems have a way of asking very patient questions. Later that night, Clara and I sat quietly in the living room. The television was on, but neither of us were really watching it. Clara finally said something that surprised me. I used to think power meant being the loudest person in the room. What do you think now? I asked. She looked toward the stack of documents on the table. I think power might be the person who keeps the records. I smiled slightly. That's closer to the truth. Because what Ethan and Dorothy had never understood was that Robert Cole had built something into the system long before any of this happened. A safeguard, one that waited quietly until someone asked the right questions. And now, those questions had begun moving through every part of their financial world, which meant the final stage was approaching. Confirmation. The tightening didn't happen all at once. Systems rarely move that way. Instead, the changes arrived quietly, one document at a time, until the structure that once looked solid began showing the outlines of its weaknesses. The first notice came from the trust's brokerage account. Angela Moreno forwarded the message late Friday afternoon. Account activity restriction, temporary compliance hold. The explanation was simple. Until the Fiduciary Review Board completed its preliminary inquiry, the Cole Family Trust would be restricted from moving large financial assets without secondary verification. Clara read the message twice. So they can't move money? Not freely, I said. The following Monday, another letter arrived. This one from the County Recorder's Office. Property transfers associated with the Cole Family Trust had been flagged for documentation review. That meant any sale or refinancing attempt would now require additional review from the Fiduciary Board. Clara leaned back in her chair slowly. It's like everything is freezing. That's exactly what's happening. Financial systems have a particular way of tightening around uncertainty. They don't accuse. They don't speculate. They simply pause. And when large assets stop moving, the people who depend on those movements begin to feel the pressure. The first visible reaction came from Ethan. 3 days later, he attempted to contact Clara through his attorney. The message was polite, structured, carefully worded. Ethan was willing to discuss resolution if Clara agreed to withdraw the protection order and clarify certain statements made during the trust inquiry. Clara looked at the letter quietly for a moment. Then she handed it to Daniel. "What do you think?" she asked. Daniel smiled faintly. "I think someone just discovered that escrow doesn't move without signatures." Clara exhaled slowly. "And they need mine." Yes, but the pressure didn't stop there. 2 days later, Dorothy's attorney sent another notice. This one requested mediation regarding the trust dispute. Not a demand, a request. That alone told me something important. Dorothy had spent decades controlling every financial decision inside that family. People like that rarely ask for mediation unless they realize control has shifted somewhere outside their reach. Meanwhile, the Fiduciary Review Board continued its quiet work. Their investigators contacted the property contractor who had renovated the rental house after Robert Cole's death. The man had kept surprisingly detailed records: invoices, structural diagrams, inspection photographs. One photograph in particular drew attention: the staircase. The original wooden railing had been replaced during the renovation, but the contractor had taken pictures before the work began. Daniel showed us the photo late one evening. The staircase was narrow, steep, and positioned against a wall with no handrail on the inside edge. Clara studied the image. "That looks dangerous." "Yes," Daniel said, "but that's not what caught the investigator's attention." "What did?" He tapped the corner of the photograph, a timestamp, taken 2 weeks before Robert Cole's death. Clara frowned. "So the staircase existed before the accident?" "Yes." "But remember what the original report said?" Clara thought for a moment. Then she said it aloud. "The fall happened at the main house." Daniel nodded. "That house has no staircase like this." The documentation gap widened. But the most important moment arrived 3 days later. The Fiduciary Review Board requested a formal meeting, not with Clara, with Dorothy. That request travelled through her attorney first, then through Ethan's, finally through Daniel. I remember the exact sentence in the email. Attendants requested to clarify administrative discrepancies related to trust governance and asset transfer authorization. That sentence carried the calm weight of institutional language, but the meaning behind it was simple. The system wanted answers. 2 days later, Dorothy appeared again. Not at my house, at Daniel's office. The meeting room felt colder than usual that afternoon. Not physically, but emotionally. The quiet that filled the space carried the tension of something approaching resolution. Dorothy sat across the table, her attorney beside her, Daniel on Clara's side, and me beside my daughter. The fiduciary board representative joined by video call. His voice remained neutral throughout the conversation. "We are reviewing the trust administration process following Robert Cole's death," he said. Dorothy's attorney nodded. "Of course," the representative continued. "We have identified 3 issues requiring clarification." He raised one finger. "Trust amendment validity." Second finger, "Beneficiary exclusion attempt." Third finger, "Asset liquidation prior to beneficiary confirmation." The room stayed quiet. Then the representative asked the first direct question. "Mrs. Cole, did you authorize the attempted amendment removing Clara Lawson as beneficiary?" Dorothy answered calmly. "Yes." "Did you obtain beneficiary consent?" "No." The representative typed something into his notes. "Thank you." The second question followed. "Were you aware that the original trust required all beneficiaries to acknowledge structural amendments?" Dorothy's voice remained controlled. I believed the clause no longer applied. Another pause as the representative wrote again. Then he asked the final question. "Were you aware that the trust included a death trigger clause preventing asset liquidation during unresolved beneficiary disputes?" Dorothy hesitated. Only briefly, but long enough. "No." The representative leaned slightly toward the camera. "Mrs. Cole, that clause has remained active since the trust was created." Silence filled the room. Finally, the representative spoke again. Until the inquiry concludes, the trust assets will remain under compliance restriction. Then he added something that settled the matter completely. Further administrative authority over the trust will be temporarily reassigned. Clara looked up. To whom? Daniel asked. The representative answered calmly. To the beneficiaries. For the first time since the dinner night months earlier, Dorothy's composure cracked. Only slightly, but enough to see. The control she had exercised for years had shifted quietly away from her. Not through argument, not through confrontation, through procedure. Later that evening, Clara and I returned home. The house felt peaceful in a way it hadn't for weeks. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking out the window at the quiet street. I kept thinking something dramatic would happen, she said. What do you mean? Like in movies, shouting, confessions, some big ending. I smiled slightly. Real systems rarely work that way. How do they work? Quietly. She nodded. Then she said something thoughtful. I think Ethan believed silence meant permission. I poured 2 cups of tea and set one in front of her. Some people always believe that. Clara looked down at the paperwork resting on the table. Then she said softly, but silence isn't permission. I nodded. No. And that was the moment I realized something had changed inside her. The fear that had followed her through years of quiet tension had finally loosened its grip. Not because someone had rescued her, but because she had learned how systems actually work. And once someone understands that, they stop being afraid of the people who once controlled them. The final confirmation arrived 3 weeks later. But by then, the outcome was already clear. The final confirmation arrived on a quiet Thursday afternoon. There was no dramatic phone call, no courtroom announcement, just another envelope. By then, Clara and I had grown used to the rhythm of official correspondence. Still, something about this one felt different. The return address carried the same formal seal we had seen weeks earlier. Ohio State Fiduciary Review Board. Clara placed the envelope on the kitchen table, but didn't open it immediately. Outside, the neighborhood was moving through an ordinary early evening. A lawnmower hummed faintly down the street. A car passed slowly with its windows open, music drifting through the warm air. Life continuing. Eventually, Clara sat down and slid a finger carefully beneath the envelope flap. Inside were 3 pages. The first page summarized the review. The language remained calm and neutral, exactly the way institutional conclusions are written. Administrative review outcome. Following documentation, verification, and beneficiary confirmation, the board had concluded that the attempted trust amendments removing Clara Lawson as beneficiary were invalid. The amendment lacked beneficiary acknowledgement. The clause remained binding. Clara continued reading. The second paragraph addressed asset control. Temporary restrictions on the trust would remain in place until a new administrative structure was confirmed. However, administrative authority would no longer be held solely by Dorothy Cole. Instead, the trust would now require joint beneficiary oversight for any future financial decisions. Clara looked up slowly. So she can't control it anymore? No, I said. The third page addressed the property transfers. The attempted liquidation of the rental property had been voided. The escrow freeze would remain until the trust administrators now, including Clara, approved any future action. Clara folded the letter carefully. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said quietly, "That house started all of this." Yes. She looked at the documents again. And the staircase. I nodded. The staircase opened the questions. We never received a dramatic explanation for Robert Cole's death. The review board's authority extended only to trust governance and financial compliance. But sometimes, systems don't need to solve every mystery to reveal what matters. The financial structure Robert had built had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had waited. And when the right questions appeared, it had protected the people he intended to protect. A week later, Clara met with Daniel and the trust's financial administrators. Together, they reviewed the asset schedule, commercial leases, investment accounts, 3 properties. The old rental house still sat quietly on the list. Clara studied it for a moment. "What should we do with it?" she asked. Daniel shrugged slightly. "That decision belongs to the beneficiaries now." Clara thought about it for a long moment. Finally, she said something that surprised everyone in the room. "Sell it." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure?" "Yes." "Why?" Clara leaned back in her chair. "Some places hold too many questions." The property sold 2 months later. The proceeds were placed into the trust's investment accounts. No drama, no ceremony, just paperwork moving through the system. Ethan eventually accepted a plea agreement related to the assault charge. The terms required counseling and probation. After the protection order remained in place for 6 months, the court extended it another year. Clara never saw him again. Dorothy withdrew from most public involvement with the family businesses. Her attorney continued managing certain corporate matters, but the trust itself now required oversight from multiple beneficiaries, which meant her control had ended quietly. The social rumors faded over time the way most rumors do. People moved on. Work continued. Ordinary life resumed its pace. One evening, months later, Clara and I sat on the same back patio where we had talked during the early days of the investigation. The air was cool. The street was quiet. Clara held a cup of tea between her hands. "I keep thinking about something," she said. "What?" "That night at dinner." I waited. She smiled slightly. "When Dorothy said hitting me was how I would learn." "Yes." Clara looked out toward the darkening street. "For a long time, I thought silence meant surviving. I didn't interrupt. But now I realize something else." "What?" "Silence isn't permission." The words settled gently into the evening air. I nodded. "No," I said. "It isn't." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Clara added something thoughtful. "Ethan believed he controlled everything. Many people do." She looked back at the stack of documents resting on the small table beside us. Court orders, trust confirmations, compliance letters, evidence of a system that had moved quietly, patiently, and exactly as it was designed to move. "He thought being loud meant being powerful," she said. I smiled faintly. "Some people never learn the difference." She tilted her head slightly. "And what is the difference?" I thought about that for a moment before answering. "Power doesn't come from speaking first." The porch light flickered on above us as evening deepened. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and then fell quiet again. Clara leaned back in her chair. "I'm glad you came to that dinner." "So am I." The memory of that night felt distant now, like something that had belonged to another life. Clara looked toward the quiet neighborhood one more time. "You know what the strangest part is?" she said. "What?" "For years, I thought Ethan and Dorothy were the strongest people in the room. I waited. But they weren't." She gestured lightly toward the paperwork beside us. "The system was." I nodded slowly. "Yes. Because people sometimes mistake control for strength, but real strength often looks quieter than that. It looks like patience, records, procedures, structures, built carefully by someone who understood that the truth does not need to shout. It only needs to be written down. And when the time comes, those records speak for themselves. If stories about quiet boundaries and the power of patience resonate with you, you're welcome to stay. Some lessons arrive loudly. Others arrive the way this one did, quietly. But once you see them, you never mistake silence for permission again.